in the world in Taiwan. If you've been following developments in Asia, you also know that that area is fraught with disagreements between particularly mainland China and Taiwan about Taiwan's status, whether it should remain independent or should be joined together with China. Navigation through the South China Sea, obviously concerns about pandemics, natural disasters, all of those jeopardize the supply chain of these high-end, most advanced semiconductors from Asia to the United States. And as we've all learned, we've become more and more dependent on the technology that's represented by the semiconductor industry. I can't think of any part of our life that hasn't become better, more productive because of the growth of semiconductors. Everything from your cell phone to your car to you name it. Everything's sort of almost like a computer on wheels today, your cars are. But I was just talking to John about one other sort of revelation that occurred to me. In Congress and in the state of Texas, we've been talking a lot about access to broadband, and it's vitally important. We've seen how dependent we are during the pandemic on our children learning online. Obviously, getting access to broadband is really important, and that's an area where we've focused a lot on, I know both at the state and the federal level, how to improve access to broadband, because it's no longer just a convenience, it's really literally a necessity, I think we've seen. But imagine the extent to which we need to also function on these tiny microcircuits that make that broadband possible, which build the computers, which make it possible for students to access their educational materials, or physicians to interact with their patients, for example, using telemedicine. All of that depends not only on access to broadband, but access to these tiny microcircuits known as semiconductors. So we know how important this is. China is building 17 semiconductor manufacturing facilities as we speak. The United States is seeing one built in Arizona right now by Taiwan Semiconductor. So we need to think differently about how we encourage manufacturing of this vital component in our daily life here in America. Not only will that produce good, well-paying jobs, it will shore up the vulnerable supply chains that we saw exposed during COVID-19. Because if for some reason our access to the semiconductors made in Asia were cut off, as I said, as a result of a conflict of some kind, a pandemic, or a natural disaster, it would have dramatically bad consequences on the United States. And we've seen this in the automobile industry, for example, because the automobile industry cut some of their orders for semiconductors thinking that, well, because of the pandemic, the demand would not be as high, only to find out the demand remained very robust. And so now a number of the car manufacturers are simply playing catch up, and the semiconductor capacity, manufacturing capacity, has been unable to supply them with all the semiconductors they need to keep their workforce employed and to be able to sell those vehicles. So this is a very, very important issue. It's not one that's foremost in most people's minds. And I want to credit my friend and colleague, Michael McCall, who we're here in his congressional district, who's been my key partner on getting this done. We've now passed it in the House, in the Senate. We need to get this passed in the House of Representatives. And at least in some areas like this, I hope we can continue to see the kind of bipartisanship that allowed us to get a 68-vote threshold in the Senate on this particular bill, the CHIPS for America Act and the Endless Frontiers Act. And I hope now we can get this passed in the House of Representatives so we can get shore up this vulnerability and make sure that the United States remains the strongest economy and the strongest military power in the world. And it all starts with semiconductors.
Senator, you alluded to this while you were doing the roundtable discussion a moment ago. Industry analysts have called it the chips crisis, the new oil crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone who was alive in the 70s will remember that. I've been told about it.
You and I were both alive in that period of time. Well, actually, Jimmy Carter in 1980 gave a very famous speech where he said, anybody blocks the Strait of Hormuz, which is a strategic choke point for the movement of oil through the Middle East to the rest of the world, anyone blocks that, it would be the equivalent of a declaration of war.
So my question is, Senator, if chips are the new oil, why hasn't this legislation already passed the House? Are you concerned that people just don't get it?
Well, that's part of the reason we're here today, so more and more people became aware of something that, frankly, a year ago, I did not appreciate the way I do today. And so people can understand why this is a threat to their jobs, why this is a threat to our national security, why this is a threat to the economy, having vulnerable supply chains. The pandemic taught us a lot of really important lessons, and to me, this was the number one lesson, that we can't just export, or I should say import, products made overseas just because it's cheaper to make it there. There are some strategic investments we need to make here in the United States, and particularly when it comes to semiconductors. I think that's the start, but there's others that we could add to that list. But this is part of getting it done in the Senate, and now getting it done in the House, and raising public awareness of how vital this is to the Texas economy and the U.S. economy and to our national security.
Senator, obviously funding is a huge part of this, but also like you talked about severe weather, these fabs are very fragile as well. We have the Texas freeze, the winter storms. Have you talked with state leaders about making sure that the power grid can support companies like these that take a lot of power to make chips that are, the new oil?
Well, I know that these manufacturing facilities are huge consumers of electricity, and I think the polar vortex a few months back taught us all that, again, what we've come to take for granted, which is when we flip a switch, when we turn on the compressor to get natural gas into a pipeline so it can go to power and create electricity, we took that for granted. I know the Texas legislature has taken a lot of steps to make sure that we weatherize those components, but this is also about things like cybersecurity, which John tells me, and I know all of these technology companies are very vigilant at the hundreds of thousands of cyber attacks occurring on a regular basis to a lot of our critical manufacturing facilities. We saw what happened on the East Coast when the Colonial Pipeline was compromised by a cyber attack. These are occurring on a regular basis, and we simply need to up our game. So yes, there are a number of different things like our electric grid that are, I think, critical infrastructure. We need to protect them from cold weather, bad weather. We need to protect them from cyber attacks, and we need to make sure they're more reliable. And so I think there's a whole list of things that we need to do to make sure that that electricity remains there for consumers, for the public, for hospitals, and for our manufacturing facilities like this.
Senator, how do you balance, Texas wanting to be the biggest invested and at the forefront of technology, but with the attitude that some Texans don't want government too involved in business and in this process? What concerns do you have about government subsidizing any part of this?
Well, I think that's a critical point, and we need to be clear-eyed about exactly what's happening in our number one competitor in the world, China. China is investing tens of billions of dollars, not only in semiconductor manufacturing capability, but in technologies like 5G, quantum computing, artificial intelligence. These are not necessarily areas where the supply and demand that drives manufacturing is responding to, because it's really a strategic investment they're making. So I think we need to think a little differently. I'm not interested in the federal government getting in business with these manufacturers. They know what they do better than the government does, and they can do it better than anybody else in the world if given the opportunity to compete on a level playing field. But simply stated, what China is doing is they want to become the dominant economy and the dominant superpower in the world. And that's a vulnerability for the United States, both economically and from a national security standpoint. So we can't simply rely on maybe the way we used to think about those issues, that just because it was made in China and cheaper, that was okay. will buy cheaper consumer goods here in the United States. We need to think differently, I think, in light of these developing events in China and around the world.
Senator, you expressed, this is somewhat of a follow-on question, you expressed your concern about the government becoming involved in this. What do you believe needs to happen then from the private sector that would augment what this bill would accomplish if passed?
Well, as we originally introduced the bill, it was a tax credit, which actually, if there is another companion bill filed now in the Senate, I think we need to do both. We need this emergency funding, and we need that tax credit to pass, so that because these are huge, expensive, multi-year projects, there needs to be some reliable source of funding available, because companies like Samsung and the others that you heard from today aren't going to begin to build one of these facilities if they don't believe that they can complete it, and based on a predictable flow of funds or tax credits that will allow them to do it. But most states and cities already have some form of incentive to encourage companies to come to their states. We've got the Enterprise Fund, I think, here in Texas, if I'm recalling the name of it, that provides some incentives. The federal government simply has not been in that game. And generally speaking, I don't really want the federal government in that game, except where it's essential to our maintaining our leadership role in the economy, the global economy, and our national security. And so I think China has given us no alternative but to engage in this sort of new approach and strategic investment. And only the federal government has the resources to do that. But we don't want to be in the business because, frankly, the federal government, if they got involved in the semiconductor manufacturing business, we'd probably screw it up.
You talked a little bit about the disconnect maybe between the average person and thinking about semiconductors and the role they play and maybe getting fully on board with this. How can you explain to that consumer what these supply chain deficiencies and lack of having enough manufacturing plants in the U.S., how that can impact the average consumer cost-wise and availability-wise?
Yeah. Well, we're seeing the availability problem right now in cars and car manufacturing here, that employees at car manufacturing facilities are being laid off because there is not a reliable supply of semiconductors needed to build those cars. All of our cars are becoming more and more like computers on wheels. And literally, when you think semiconductors, think about anything with an off and on switch. We take it for granted. I know we all take it for granted that our cell phone is going to operate, which includes, I don't know how many semiconductors, but it's a lot of them. And obviously, things like telemedicine, getting access to your doctor using a computer and a virtual connection is one of the ways we can improve access to health care. We've seen the importance of technology for our students to be connected during the pandemic. This is affecting average Texas families on a dramatic level, and I think we just need to do a better job of explaining to them why this is important. That's the reason we're here today, to try to add to that information.
If I have one more question.
Senator, just could you clarify, looking at, we've got two pieces of legislation here. We've got the main framework. Now we're trying to activate and provide money to make that element within the framework, the act itself. Otherwise, it's a paper tiger.
That's right. Last year, when we passed, this is part of the National Defense Authorization Act. I believe it was 96-4, so it was a huge, overwhelming vote. But now we need the funds to be able to actually make it happen. That could come one of two ways, either through an appropriation like this CHIPS for America, $52 billion that passed the Senate recently, or I should say, and it could occur through a tax credit, which is operating down a separate track. But yes, we've gotten half of the work done. We need to complete the job and make this a reality, and only the House of Representatives can make that happen at this point. We're working hand in glove with the administration and the Secretary of Commerce, so this is not a partisan issue. This is just something we need to get done and maintain our vigilance so that it does get done before we fall prey to this vulnerability. Thank you.
Before everyone leaves, can we get a quick line real quick, Senator, we'll put you right in the middle. All right, just gonna slide this just a tad bit.
Okay, but Monica, we can't get you to scoot over? Yeah, everybody scoot over.
Perfect. Okay, look at this camera. You had me.
Yeah, sorry, these are Samsung cameras.
Yeah, perfect. You good? Okay, this one here. Yep. You're good. Wow, that was quick. All right, ready? 1, 2. Okay.